In keeping with the current focus of comparative eschatologies, I'd like to recommend a read. This particular book by author Charles Upton entitled Legends of the End, Prophecies of the End Times, Antichrist, Apocalypse, and Messiah, from not just one or two, but from 8 specific religious traditions. Charles Upton is a prolific author and has written on various subjects. He's an activist who has published numerous books on Sufism, metaphysics, and other topics, including today's, which is comparative eschatology. His work on eschatology is by no means exhaustive, but it is a good recommended read for an introduction if you're not familiar with comparing eschatological models. And there are literally dozens. Charles Upton was born on December 13th, 1948 in San Francisco. After graduating from Catholic high school, Upton involved himself in a number of anti-war demonstrations and became acquainted with many influential figures of the Beat generation, including Gary Snyder and Allen Ginsberg. He published his first 2 volumes of poetry at age 19. Throughout the early 80s, Upton became involved in the New Age movement for several years before being introduced to the study of traditional metaphysics. And I don't know a whole lot about the New Age movement, but it's my guess that they also study metaphysics. His increasing interest in traditional studies culminated in his initiation into a Sufi order, that is a Muslim mystical sect, near the end of the decade of the 80s. He would later revisit his prior intellectual interests in the form of a traditionalist critique of New Age spirituality, entitled The System of the Antichrist, Truth and Falsehood in Postmodernism and the New Age. And that's another recommended read, being that it does have to do with Christian eschatology. Upton currently lives with his wife in Lexington, Kentucky. And when this article was published, Upton contributed to the article the transcendent unity of religions and spiritual practice to the forthcoming World Wisdom book, Crossing Religious Frontiers. And that was a brief section, a biographical section from an article that was written around 2008. A biography on Charles Upton. So, in consideration, with comparative eschatology in mind, we have the book Legends of the End, Prophecies of the End Times, Antichrist, Apocalypse, and Messiah, from 8 religious traditions. And this back cover book report, a reading of the back cover and a small section from the text itself. He also has a section in this particular book on page 85 entitled The System of Antichrist, and I'll be reading parts of that as well to give you an idea of what Upton has in mind with his view on comparative eschatologies, not just within one tradition, but 8. He compares them, noticing their similarities and differences. Ever since the advent of nuclear weapons, biological warfare, and irreversible degradation of the environment, we've all been facing the quote-unquote end of days. Whether the world ends tomorrow or lasts for centuries, this is the climate of our times. We're all more or less familiar with the Christian apocalyptic scenarios, but what do the other world religions have to say about the quote-unquote last days? This book presents 8 legends of the end from Hindu, Buddhist, Zoroastrian, Jewish, Christian, Muslim, Hopi, and Lakota traditions. The Hopi and Lakota were Indian. When these stories are placed side by side, great differences and amazing similarities appear. Similarities both in broad outlines and in minute details. Every spiritual tradition must include both a story of the beginning and a myth of the final end. In other words, an Alpha and Omega. The end of the earth, of the universe, of time itself. In relation to this end, the secular worldview limits us to the perspective of fear, the fear of the end of life, the dissolution of matter, but in the spiritual worldview, the fear of material disaster is swallowed up in the unveiling of eternal truths. Apocalypse means revelation, or to unveil. That would be presumably something that already exists, but is as yet to be seen once the veil of forgetfulness is lifted. Apocalypse means revelation, hence the book of Revelation. In light of these 8 legends of the end, the author here presents a penetrating spiritual meditation on the meaning of the end from different perspectives. Without a grasp of this meaning, to date, the end is impossible. With such a grasp, even the most accurate dating is irrelevant. To know the meaning of the end of days is already to be beyond it. Charles Upton is a serious writer from whom I have learned much. His writings deserve close attention. Professor Houston Smith, author of The World's Religions, etc. Here is what Charles Upton says concerning the system of the Antichrist. And I'll have a brief reading of this particular section. And he goes further in the sequel to this book, The System of the Antichrist, as well. And I'll read a brief description of that after I read a portion from Legends of the End. The system of Antichrist, according to Revelation 20:7 and 8, quote, when the 1,000 years are expired, the millennium during which the devil is bound, identified by Orthodox theologians as the church age. In a dispensational view, Satan shall be loosed out of his prison and shall go out to deceive the nations which are in the 4 quarters of the earth, Gog and Magog, to gather them together to battle, the number of whom is as the sand of the sea. According to the Apocalypse of St. John, an Orthodox commentary by Archbishop Averki of Jordanville, the meaning of Gog in Hebrew is a gathering, or one who gathers, and of Magog, meaning an exaltation, or one who exalts. Exaltation suggests to me the idea of transcendence as opposed to unity. Gathering, the idea of unity as opposed to transcendence. The implication here is that one of the deepest deceptions of Antichrist in the last days of the cycle will be to set these two integral aspects of the absolute in opposition to other in the collective mind and on a global scale in the four quarters of the earth. So it would be that Antichrist would set up the transcendent and oppose it with the unity. The two integral aspects of the absolute in opposition to each other in the collective mind is what he says. And on a global scale. In other words, the divide and conquer technique. As for the economic and political expression of this barren satanic polarity, the false cohesion of left-wing tyranny, as well as today's global capitalism, would fall under Gog, while both the false hierarchical system of right-wing tyranny and the violent absolutism of the various tribal separatist movements opposed to globalism, both ethnic and religious, would come under Magog. In terms of religion, those liberal historicist, evolutionist, quasi-materialist, and crypto-pagan theologies, which emphasize God's immanence as opposed to his transcendence, are a part of Gog. The emphasis is on God's immanence, pantheism, as opposed to his transcendence, classical theism. While those reactionary theologies, which exalt transcendence over immanence, look on the material world as a vale of tears, denigrate the human body, and view the destruction of nature with indifference, if not secret approval, since the best we can hope for is to get it all over with, are part of Magog. The conflict between the two is precisely the satanic counterfeit of the true eschatological conflict described in Revelation 19:11 through 20, between the King of Kings and Lord of Lords and the beast with his false prophet. Those who can be lured to fight in a counterfeit war between elements which ought to be reconciled because they are essentially parts of the same whole reality as seen in a distorting mirror, will miss their call to fight in the true war between forces which neither should nor can be reconciled, those of the truth and those of the big lie. Note, globalism, insofar as it sets the stage for the emergence of Guten's inverted hierarchy, also contains the seed of Magog, while tribalism, as the common inheritance of all who are excluded from the global elite, holds the seed of Gog. In the latter days, no party or class or sector can long retain its ideological stability, the rate of contradiction approaches the speed of light. In a world profoundly polarized between the Gog of syncretist globalism and the Magog of exclusivist tribalism, a word which is beginning to denote what used to be called nationalism or patriotism or loyalty to one's religion, the transcendent unity of religions clearly represents a middle path or a third force, at least in the religious field. It is equally opposed to the universalism of the global elites and the violent self-assertion of the fundamentalist tribes oppressed and marginalized by the elites. So those fundamentalist tribes, I would say, are exclusivists. Perhaps this is one reason why groups and individuals who hold to this doctrine have been subjected to the immense degree of psychic pressure, which observers on the outskirts of the traditionalist school, such as myself, cannot fail to know. It is reasonable to conjecture that Antichrist would like nothing better than to subvert and discredit the traditionalists, since the transcendent unity of religions is one of the few worldviews that could possibly stand in the way of the barren and terminal conflict between globalism and tribalism, which is the keynote of his system in the social arena. If all possible alternatives to the struggle between globalism and tribalism disappear from the collective mind, then Antichrist has won. He can use economic and political globalism and the universalism of a world fusion spirituality to subvert and oppress all integral religions and religious cultures, forcing them to narrow their focus and violate the fullness of their own traditions in reaction against it. He can drive them to bigoted and terroristic excesses, which will make them seem barbaric and outdated in the eyes of those wavering between a global and a tribal identification, and set them at each other's throats at the same time. Unite to oppress, divide and conquer. In this light, we can see that the exclusivism of conservative and or traditional religions, specifically Christianity, is both its greatest strength and its greatest weakness. The same could be said with certain reservations of Judaism and Islam as well. The exclusivism of these Abrahamic religions allows them to consciously fortify themselves against the system of Antichrist. Christianity, by its catacomb spirit, its ability ultimately derived from monasticism to build spiritual fortresses against the world, and Islam by the fact that Dar al-Islam remains the largest bloc of humanity, which in part is still socially and politically organized around a divine revelation, although to greatly varying degrees, as were medieval Europe and the Byzantine Empire. On the other hand, their very exclusivism has prevented these religions, in all but a few instances, from making common cause against globalist universalism and secularism. They remain vulnerable to the divide and conquer tactics of the system of Antichrist, a phrase which could well be the prelude if traditional eschatological speculations, such as those found in Eagleman's Ultimate Things, are to be believed, to a later unite to oppress phase, a capitulation of the exhausted exclusivists longing for the end of endless conflict to the satanic universalism of Antichrist himself. According to Ultimate Things, Antichrist will reveal himself in Jerusalem and proclaim himself King of the Jews. The Jewish nation, as well as many Christians, will accept him, at least according to this. From the Islamic perspective, however, any world ruler who begins as a king of the Jews and is later submitted to by the Christians would be immediately and universally recognized as Antichrist itself. And it is inconceivable unless traditional and even fundamentalist Islam were to virtually disappear, that such a figure could tempt Muslims to accept him as the Mahdi or the eschatological Jesus. So if the predictions Engelman accounts are in any way accurate, and in many ways they are speculative, as is much of eschatological reflection, and if they are in any way accurate, he is in fact presenting as the most likely eschatological scenario a mass apostasy of Jews and Christians, which would leave only the Muslims aware of who Antichrist really is and ready to do battle with him. How then could Antichrist emerge as a global monarch, albeit a satanic one? Perhaps the militant opposition of an Islam discredited in the eyes of the rest of the world to an almost universally admired savior is the very thing which will ultimately consolidate power. I hasten to say that this is in no way a prediction, God forbid. I am simply allowing myself to imagine various scenarios based on the quality of ultimate irony and self-contradiction, which is the keynote of all historical forces in these latter days. And one of the twists of this irony is the fact that many semi-secularized Muslims, for example, seem much more in tune with the mores of postmodern globalist culture than any Christian I could name. If the greatest strength and greatest weakness of traditional Christianity is in its exclusivism, the comparable strength and weaknesses of Buddhism, especially in the West, is its ability to fit in. The same goes for heterodox, westernized Hinduism and various influences such as Feng Shui, Taoist meditation, and Sino-Japanese martial arts originating in the Far East. At its best, this represents a radical detachment from the norms of the world, allowing it to avoid all forms of dogmatic literalism and fundamentalism, and the marginalization such a stance often entails. And at its worst, it indicates a capitulation to the collective egoism of this very quote-unquote world or world system. In the United States, at least, Buddhism is an acceptable part of the general neo-pagan cultural drift, which, while it may not identify with globalism, nonetheless often ends by serving it. The same is true of certain strands of American Sufism, especially those which attempt to separate the Sufi tradition from Islam. As a religion which recognizes a fall or into ignorance and posits a goal of salvation via enlightenment, it naturally has a much greater affinity with the Abrahamic religions than with a paganism which accepts the ontological status quo and seeks only to profit from it. But that's not how things have worked out sociologically. American Buddhism, as a neo-theistic or non-theistic religion, though certainly not an atheism, since it possesses a doctrine of divinity or of the absolute has been attractive to many people, especially as it turns out, many American Jews who are in flight of their own narrow-minded and superstitious ideas of God. An acquaintance of mine, a traditional Catholic who studied for years under the Hopi elders, tells the story of a Buddhist Halloween party where a well-known American Buddhist teacher dressed in as a Sufi made the statement that Buddhism is better than the Abrahamic religions because, just like the Native Americans, the Buddhists don't believe in quote-unquote God. A statement which my friend knew from long personal experience with Native American spirituality to be totally false. It was nonetheless an idea which would play well to the general liberal New Age and neo-pagan culture from which this teacher draws his students, the kind of people whose appreciation for the American Indians is even more destructive to Native American spirituality than their attraction to Buddhism is to Buddhism. The false ecumenism of neo-pagan New Age culture is the seed bed for the world fusion spirituality in which fragments of every spiritual tradition are promiscuously thrown together to their mutual corruption, compared in contrast to true ecumenism, which is another word for interfaith, interreligious dialogue. On the other hand, the outer expression of the esoteric ecumenism of the transcendent unity of religions, which understands the very uniqueness and particularity of the authentic religious traditions as the transcendent basis for their unity. It is not a syncretic amalgam or a diplomatic glossing over of doctrinal differences, but a united front against a common enemy, that unholy alliance of scientism, magical materialism, and I would add atheistic philosophy, idolatry of the psyche, and postmodern nihilism, which is headed with all deliberate speed toward the system of Antichrist. And that's my quote from Legends of the End, Prophecies of the End Times, Antichrist, Apocalypse, and Messiah from 8 Religious Traditions by author Charles Upton. And again, he also has a follow-up on that particular subject where he focuses on the system of Antichrist itself. And this is entitled The System of Antichrist, Truth and Falsehood in Postmodernism and the New Age. So he compares two opposing ecumenical movements, one by Antichrist, and I would imagine the other is led by God himself. And of course, a few of Satan's and Lucifer's tactics are to emulate or copycat exactly, almost to the T, everything that God does in the world, so as to confuse and perhaps enforce the ambition to overthrow the God who made him, in a nutshell. So from Goodreads, The System of Antichrist, Truth and Falsehood in Postmodernism and the New Age, investigates the present religious and cultural scene from the standpoint of traditional metaphysics and critiques the New Age spiritualities. A lot of confusion between what is New Age and what is esoteric Christianity exists as well. And many traditionalist Orthodox Christians confuse these. And that is exactly why many will confuse Christ for Antichrist in the last days. And it is to Satan's advantage to cause that confusion. So what Christians expect to be Antichrist could very well be the appearance of Christ, unknown to them. This book presents lore relating to the latter days and the Antichrist from various religious traditions, drawing on the writings of the leading perennialist thinkers, Rene Guan and Fritjof Schwann, sketches the particular quality of spirituality proper to apocalyptic times, both its dangers and the opportunities to open it. And I will probably obtain this book in the near future because I'm curious as to what he has to say about that ongoing subject. And what many traditionalist Christians consider to be Antichrist, they're confusing. And in this sense, traditionalist Christian eschatology, which is mainly fundamentalist evangelical, is found wanting and lacking any clarity. So once you do a comparative study of eschatology, religions, and theologies, you can come to these conclusions. I'm not doing this channel to tell you what to believe or who to believe, but to provide the information so that you, the listener, can make an educated conclusion. So both books I'd recommend, Legends of the End and The System of the Antichrist, author Charles Upton. To enhance your understanding and increase your knowledge of comparative eschatologies.